Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of Post-Secondary Pathways. My name is Dr. Monique Colclough. I am the Director of Programs and Initiatives at the Belk Center for Community College Leadership and Research at NC State University. And before we get started with this conversation, I want to share a little bit about the Belk Center and the roles that we play in supporting North Carolina community colleges. The Belk Center serves as a meeting place for people and ideas, furthering more equitable community college outcomes here in North Carolina. We work with educators, researchers, policymakers, and other key stakeholders to distill knowledge into more actionable insights, creating opportunities for collaboration and equipping community college leaders to tackle the most pressing issues. Our research and insights specifically focus on community college leaders as they need reliable insight, data, information that they can act on quickly. Whether it's a report or a survey or a case study, the research and data that we deliver are timely, they're relevant, and they're practical drivers of systemic change here in North Carolina. We also support North Carolina's community college leaders through coaching, practical resources that help all of the amazing ideas become some of the state's best practices. We also create opportunities for North Carolina's 58 community colleges and the people to support the colleges to come together to drive change. We connect stakeholders, we break down barriers, and we make space for institutional and systemic transformation. So you may be asking, how can the Belk Center support institutions prioritizing engagement with adult learners? The Belk Center has played an active role in the North Carolina Reconnect work by engaging with those leaders and driving this work on individual campuses and sharing the lessons learned across the 58 colleges. Specifically, we provide comprehensive data reporting on how the colleges are collectively meeting their adult learner engagement, enrollment, and retention goals. We also work with individual campuses to support unique efforts through professional development or through gathering data about adult learners. The Belk Center also seeks to make research and data accessible to diverse audiences, and we've done so for Reconnect by distributing a guidebook. The Adult Learner Guidebook we developed provides a detailed look into adult learner populations in North Carolina, examining key learnings and opportunities from the North Carolina Reconnect program, and offers insights and lessons learned from community college leaders, faculty, staff, and students. For those of you who are just logging on, thank you so much for joining us in this three-part series between the Belk Center and the Hunt Institute and our partnership. Before the conversation gets started, I wanted to provide a brief logistical overview of this time together. We'll start the discussion with about a 30-minute moderated discussion with our panelists, and then we'll pivot to question and answers with you all, the audience. If you have any questions throughout the discussion, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature on the very bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to address your questions during the discussion. Additionally, we will record the conversation and post it on our YouTube channel so that you may have access to it later on. For those of you who are attending today's discussion, we also encourage you to share the conversation on social media using the hashtag #postpathways. You can also find the hashtag and all of the conversation pieces following the Hunt Institute's social media channel. With that being said, I am excited to introduce our moderator for this session, Dr. Laura Leatherwood. She is the president of Blue Ridge Community College, which is home to 3 campuses, serving over 10,000 students in Henderson and Transylvania counties in Western North Carolina. Dr. Leatherwood was named the 2022 President of the Year for the North Carolina Community College System. She also has spent her career as an advocate for community colleges at the local, state, and national levels through the American Association of Community Colleges and the North Carolina Association of Community College Presidents. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Leatherwood, and thank you for your continued leadership here in North Carolina.
Thank you so much, Monique, and thank you all for joining us today to talk about North Carolina's work to engage adult learners. So a little bit about the story of Blue Ridge. As she mentioned, we're one of North Carolina's great 58 colleges nestled in Flat Rock, North Carolina, which is actually Western North Carolina. And our college, we were established in 1969, so we're about 54 years old, but we occupy both rural and urban areas. And I think that's really important to remember as you think about this NC Reconnect. We were one of the 5 original pilot colleges for the NC Reconnect project. And at that time, our college was a pivotal moment as we began to emerge from the pandemic, which really opened up the opportunity to evaluate most everything that we do. This was really a launch pad, or I call it a spark, to ignite a restart of our institution. And the flexibility that we had to practice throughout the pandemic really gave us the ability to try something new with minimal risk, or at least it made it easier to make a change without the institution actually being paralyzed from the change itself. So we evaluated and fully retooled several different things. And we did our marketing language to speak to adults. We noticed that we were really talking to a traditional high school student. We also recruited in every location across our community, including our faith-based communities, very much non-traditional recruiting. In other words, people said, I see you everywhere. I see the college everywhere. And then we used data to determine the best locations in our targeted areas of where we would recruit. In addition to that, we really kind of upped our game with our ground game, what we call our ground game. So we deployed all of our nonprofits as part of our recruiters. So we had 160 nonprofits, and we actually had them out recruiting students for us and engaging people in the community. And then once we realized that we were going to get adult students back on campus, we felt like that we needed to do everything we could for those returning to ensure that they made it to completion. So we hired success coaches for those adult students. And then once they got here, we want to make sure they had a great start. We gave them a starter pack. And then we also came to the table with a financial package. In other words, we actually called it free college, but it was really a last dollar scholarship. And that was a really important piece that we paired with that. So how did we do? Real quick, some data. Our first semester, which was fall 2021, we saw an overall increase of 9% in terms of our head count on the degree side of the house. And then if you look at full-time equivalent, or FTE, we call it 14% increase from the previous fall. What's important for this discussion, a data point, is that our adult learner enrollment that one semester increased by 41% from the fall 2020 to fall 2021. So fast forward, here we are, fall of 2022, almost 2 years, about a year or two into the work, and our adult learners are still increased this last semester, even another 3% from the previous semester. So right now, if you look at our student mix, our adults are now accounting for 31.47% of our total enrollment. So that was really important for diversity in the classroom. Another very important point when you're talking about engaging adults as well is that our African-American, our Hispanic student enrollment increased significantly and continues to do so. And then one last thing that I'll add is that recruitment was great, but to add that, we saw retention and completion numbers up across the board. And that was mainly in a lot of our high quality credentials that are really important. So as we think about increasing post-secondary attainment and closing equity gaps, our adult learners are a critical component of the equation. So I'm excited to be joined today by many of the developers and fiercest supporters of NC Reconnect. So thank you all for your advocacy and for joining me today to talk about this work. First, we have the Honorable Deanna Ballard, State Senator in the North Carolina General Assembly. Next, we have Shauna Davis, the Strategy Director for Community College Participation at Lumina Foundation. And lastly, we have Mike Krause, the Senior Advisor to the John M. Belk Endowment. As Monique mentioned, we're going to dive into a discussion and leave ample time for Q&A at the end. So if you would please submit your questions using the Q&A feature below, we will get to those questions. Okay, Shauna, I'd like to start with you to set the stage for the importance of engaging with adult learners. Your work at Lumina includes a portfolio of work designed to increase enrollment and re-enrollment in associate degree and credentialing programs. What is the role of adult learners in meeting a state's workforce needs, and what national trends are you seeing?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So happy to be here with everyone today. Certainly when we have more adults in employment and they are not just surviving, but they are thriving, that's good for our economy, but it's also good for our communities at large. So yes, meeting the state's workforce needs is an extremely important economic imperative. But work is such a central part of our identity and our sense of purpose. And the impact of education, training, access, and opportunity is far reaching, even more so than kind of the earning of the paycheck. It has a ripple effect throughout your life in terms of being able to access employment that you feel good about and that meets your economic needs as well. And so in our work, we engage with colleges, college systems, state higher education agencies, other education partners, those seeking to address and understand the challenges faced by students and the challenges faced by education providers, and also, how to connect with employers. What is it that we're getting people to enroll in becomes the question, and why. And so there are just a couple of things I'll highlight really quickly at a national level, at a high level. And that's just, certainly there are things that we're seeing, changing industry needs and the realities of employment in this day and age. Also, kind of the changing interest in higher education around adults as a primary, student group to really focus in on. And then, also this national conversation that many of us have heard, right, around the value of higher education and or the need or desire for certain credentials. And all of that goes hand in hand when we think about kind of you're earning a credential, but for what purpose, right? It typically is you're earning that for the purpose of being able to use that in the marketplace to increase your opportunity. So just a couple of thoughts on those things. As far as national trends, we are seeing efforts to get people excited about different industries that have traditionally relied on younger workers to kind of fill that pipeline. And with fewer younger workers, retraining adults absolutely becomes a more important focus. In addition, many of us have family, friends, or colleagues who have experienced a job loss or industry disruptions. So adults in the workforce will find themselves at some point, by your choice or circumstance, needing to develop new skills, to keep up with your chosen industry, or needing to do something entirely different because the employment options of your region or your community have shifted over the years. And so that can be based either on kind of, the exodus or the influx of industry in a particular community. And certainly, as you mentioned, you're thinking about all parts of the state, in urban and rural communities, there can be great variation there just in terms of the opportunities for employment based on industry location. So even if you stay in the same industry, right, it becomes increasingly more common that you will not necessarily stay with the same employer over the course of your entire career. In higher education, we're seeing a deeper interest in adult students. And so while community colleges in particular educate students who tend to be, older, an average age of students, kind of in the mid to late 20s, there are far greater numbers of students on our campuses across the country who fall maybe even into a slighter younger age, but who are adulting. So when we think about the number of students who lead adult lives, the implications for a college or a community or employer partnerships to really focus in there is that, at community colleges in particular, that's the majority of students often on a campus. Students who are working already, to add to the financial responsibility of the family, or they're adding to the financial needs of the family. They're accessing education, training, and programs. They need to have those programs that allow them to work and to go to school. So this idea that they're going to kind of come, train, and then get the job, they are often in a job when they're coming to us to try to train or to earn that credential. So they have to be able to do both at the same time. And I think that's just kind of a shift for some education spaces and even employer spaces to kind of that mindset that they're not kind of stopping their life to do this one thing. Life has to continue while they're in the pursuit of that thing. And then the last thing that I would focus on really quickly is that, when we talk about adults and employment, that national conversation, coming back to higher education, perhaps because they started it and didn't finish, or they're training or they're coming for the first time, it's hard to have these conversations with the needed nuance at a national level, since there is variation in regional context, local context, to get a more accurate picture of what is happening in a particular community. So in general, yes, we are an economy that is largely knowledge-based, and we recognize that having a college degree or credential post-high school can increase your employment opportunities and access to certain fields in particular. We also know that the actual outcomes vary for individuals based on the credentials they earn, where they live and the employment options in that particular region. And we know that it's not simply a matter of telling people, we call it the eat your vegetables conversation, and presenting them with labor market data. It's not just about here's employment and here's what you should do because you can make this amount of money, that there has to be a very nuanced conversation around opportunities, options, and also the risk involved. And so I'll stop there, but just kind of some of the framing and some of the things that we're seeing nationally around how people are thinking about this issue and how colleges are thinking about approaching this issue.
So Mike, let's shift to you. Could you provide us a high-level overview of Reconnect programs? So as the former executive director of the Tennessee Higher Education Commission, who developed one of the first Reconnect programs in the nation, and as senior consultant to the Belk Endowment, who is leading this work in North Carolina, can you tell us about what's critical to successfully engaging adult learners and what makes North Carolina's Reconnect program so impactful?
Well, thank you, Dr. Leatherwood. I think what makes the reason that this work is cresting right now builds on what Shauna just outlined, which is a lot of colleges, and I suspect the reason many of us are on this webinar today, have realized there is no alternative. The traditional pipeline of 18-year-old students has likely changed, at least for a generation. And so serving adult learners, first and foremost, it's a moral and economic development imperative, but it also for many colleges is an operating model imperative. And so I just think that this discussion has become more central because post-pandemic, we were all assessing a lot of things about how we operate. And I think there was a nice confluence with a lot of adults assessing their lives. Because the reality is, if your life was hard before the pandemic, it didn't get easier. It actually probably went the other direction. And so, the larger context of this policy, I think, is set against those factors. North Carolina Reconnect, NC Reconnect, as we call it, I think the piece that right now stands out to me, and we're, 3 cohorts in, is telling a college serve adult learners opaquely is like telling someone starting a workout regimen, run a marathon. Taking it in bite-sized pieces is really important, because going to any campus and saying we need to serve adult learners right now is unhelpful. However, saying, if we do these 3 things, we're going to move the needle on adult learners. And on NC Reconnect, we'll highlight, I'm sure, a few different pieces today, but the one that stands out to me the most is, if I were a president and somebody showed up and said, let's serve adult learners, a really good where to start is your adult learners that didn't complete, that Shauna also mentioned. They enrolled, they had the will, life happened. And the good news is every college knows who those adults are because they have them in their data systems and they know how to reach them. So a cornerstone of NC Reconnect is partnering with our friends at Inside Track to reach out to those students, to try to see, what could bring you back and coach them in. And coaching a student back to higher ed is a lot different than the enrollment management industrial complex that we're all used to. And I think that what we're seeing now, and I will share one data point. So right now, if you were an NC Reconnect colleges, one of our 10 colleges at which we have coached, we've had about a 21,000 student universe of adults who dropped out or stopped out within the last 5 years. Right now, about 1,800 of them are in college as we speak. And that's a pretty good day's work on cold calls, which is how these Reconnect pieces start. They start with cold calls to that student saying, hey, would you like to come back to Blue Ridge? Would you like to come back to Forsyth? And we're really excited that right now, about 15% of cold calls did. And most importantly, these students' retention rate, at least in cohort 2, is above 90%.
So this work does not happen without some fierce advocates. And Senator Ballard You have been ours in North Carolina for our community colleges and in the General Assembly. So I just want to say publicly thank you for what you've done. But what is the role of our state legislators in community college success? And how can institutional leaders better partner with local and state elected officials to promote greater student success?
Well, thank you, President Leatherwood. It's great to see you today. And I've always enjoyed being on Blue Ridge's campus too. So I'm excited about the work that you continue to do there and the efforts that you lead. I was excited when I was looking through the chat and saw maybe perhaps a few policymakers on the call today too. So the webinar. So I just ask that you guys really do pay attention. This work was a collective work with both chambers in our legislature, but it was also a proactive and forward-thinking effort. So I would say the role of even legislators at this point in the game, it's imperative that we're involved in order to support the community colleges and the work and the leadership that needs to get done. So not only do we provide funding, but I think we also provide other resources and connections, and even with the business community to, even other schools, even in other spaces that are kind of doing some of this work, even with like military nonprofits or whatever targeted groups of population that we are working towards and getting those back into college to finish their degree or their certificate and get the training that they need. So it's really like the money, the partnerships, the bridge building, the connections, really lifting up access and ensuring that we are opening and not creating barriers to pathways for these folks. And that includes thinking about, support services. That includes thinking about transportation, childcare grants. So really thinking about all those wraparound opportunities to get to come in and support these adult learners at this state in their life. And then to kind of follow up too on what Shauna was saying, I mean, it's also about educating. I find myself, I educate a lot of policymakers, even in my own chambers, about the importance of what is happening in this space and in the education sector itself. So really, being ready to educate, I guess, legislators on opportunities, options, and risk. And what the risk is by not doing this and not investing is critical, especially here in North Carolina as we work towards an attainment goal. I mean, the only way we're really going to get there is through capturing a lot of this adult learner space. So I would say that those are kind of, some of the ways that we play a big part in supporting the community colleges. And then as far as the institutional leaders and how they can kind of work together, more with like state and local officials is really educate them. I mean, get them onto your campus. And some of you know that's not rocket science. It's not elementary, but also think bigger than maybe just your district or just your community, but think through perhaps, who makes up your education committee members, invite some of those folks to your district and really show them kind of what's taking place on your campus. So again, I would just, encourage you to think bigger and to be bold and just to continue to be asking for the resources that you need. That's what we're here for.
And I think Senator Ballard makes a really good point. She was our champion in North Carolina. You have got to find a really good champion within your General Assembly. And in fact, all your presidents and all your advocacy arm of your institutions really should be doing this work. So we've got a business imperative for your states, in other words, from an economic viability standpoint, but then there's the human side, right? It's the human side of lifting up people and their families with a family sustaining wage as well. So this work is absolutely essential to all of our families and institutions. Okay, so for institutions and states on the call who want to increase their engagement with adult learners, I'm going to ask the three of you all, what advice do you have for them? Shauna, I'll let you start with that question.
So I think it's exactly what you were just saying. This piece around, I would emphasize, that you have to understand the needs of the community you're trying to reach and what they value. That's really important. So in higher education, right, we're an industry. We place a high value on empirical evidence and, and scientific discovery and all those sorts of things. And so those things are really important, but it is a human connection question. And so we are essentially a people-driven industry. We are an industry made up of people who are trying to educate people. And so that is a head and heart issue, and it has to be addressed at both sides. And so certainly many of the things that we talked about, there's a real economic imperative also to our institutions and to, the finances of our state and those sorts of things, which, definitely have merit behind them. And then the heart part of that too also goes at the heart of what the mission of a college is, and community colleges in particular in that work. So it's important that, we also understand that individuals are going to make those life decisions. Adults are going to make those life decisions largely driven by emotion and personal aspiration, our belief systems, what we think is possible for our lives. And, people are less receptive to those one-off transactional approaches to engaging them for what really comes down to being a highly personal decision, and one that comes with great sacrifice and effort. When we talk about resources for potential adult students, it's not only a matter of financial resources, but time becomes one of our most critical resources. And when you are trying to spread yourselves across work or parenting and trying to earn this credential and trying to kind of better your economic, position in life, that comes at a great sacrifice. So one of the last things I would say here is, kind of the advice I would say is that, I tell colleges all the time in my previous work, and even as we work and provide grants to colleges, to kind of go through this, what if this works scenario, right? So we're going after adults. We want to bring them into our institutions. And one of the things we say is, what if it works? What if you are wildly successful? Is your college ready for them? If they all come, are you ready? Because when they get there is not the time to try to get ready at that point. So, do you cater and program design or service delivery to people who work and go to school? Do you, have you addressed things that you said, messaging and understanding what the community thinks of your college, not only what the college thinks of itself? Process and systems, those things are certainly important. But, data-informed decision-making, which you've talked about as well. And the last thing I would say is this is a really important one. And we focused a lot on this nationally this past year, was like how people feel about the built environment of the institution. And we talked about from the website to the parking lot to the classroom, that it's extremely important that if we're bringing adults onto college who weren't able to complete the first time, or they're new to higher ed, that people are coming to a space that feels like it's adult college friendly. This is a campus or an environment where it doesn't feel like, well, we have this one office for you over here, but you actually feel like you can belong at that particular institution. So those are things that, we certainly see that you can focus on, that colleges can focus on. And I know there's a number of things. I've worked at college campuses. I've been an administrator in a system office. So I know that there are a number of things, but that's one of the things that sometimes we forget, and that we have control over on our campuses while we are working towards perfecting, many of the things that we know that we need to improve upon. But can we create an environment in which people, they come to the campus and they're willing to get out of their car or get out of public transportation and walk in, and then can they find where they need to go? And then does this feel like a place that's actually ready for me? That, I think those are very important things that you can't underestimate the impact of that.
Shauna, that's just right on target. And a lot of what we experienced here at Blue Ridge as we were welcoming back our adults, we made the assumption, excuse me, that they know nothing about coming to college, right? We had to start over. And we also realized that we got in our own way, like with some of our processes. They didn't have to be that difficult. So I think it was a really great time for us to reevaluate that. Senator Ballard, can you tell us, give us some advice about what would you say if we wanted to increase engagement with adult learners, what would be your best advice from your perspective?
Wow. I mean, Shauna really did kind of, I think, cover a lot of the items. I mean, from communication efforts, I would say as a leader, state leader, I think data does play an important role. And I think you need to think about that on the front end as you launch any sort of reconnect program, perhaps, or you're factoring that in, because you want to tell that story along the way. You want to be able to share the impact of that as you perhaps maybe go ask for additional resources or dollars too. So be, I guess, forward thinking, in that regard, in terms of what you're collecting and how you're really, I guess, investing in those connections and relationships at a local level. And then the other thing I would say, and it does piggyback a little bit too on what President Leatherwood was saying, but really legislators and leaders, state leaders, I mean, shouldn't be making assumptions either about whether it's the community college, community itself, the culture on campus, the learner that's getting back into school, what they know, they don't know. I mean, I feel like, I still work with legislators that what we call our adulting still as well. So just don't assume that even folks understand or know at the legislative level, at the state level, like what is happening, why it's important, and what is it that, you need help with in order to get it done. So that's just kind of a few thoughts.
Senator, I just recently presented to our local elected leaders, and they had to fund the college, and they had one question for me. And they said, Dr. Leatherwood, how many people did you put in the workforce last year, right? And that was all they were interested in. How many paramedics did I put in the workforce? And I think that data is really, really important, state level, local level.
And anytime, sorry, real quick, and anytime you can translate data into like a return on investment and a dollar impact from a state leader's perspective and the lens through which we look, I mean, that's always helpful and valuable as well.
Absolutely. Okay, Mike, advice.
I would talk to adult learners. And I'm afraid sometimes both at the policy formulation level and at the campus level, we create solutions we think will work without talking to the end user. If I were at the state level, as I was in the past, I would ask my community colleges to get a Zoom together of 5 adult learners on their campuses, and we'd ask them some questions. And if I was at a campus, I would quickly go try to find some adult learners and ask them some questions. Because the reality is, the bones of higher education's admissions and enrollment process exists for one reason only, and that is they were created following World War II to accommodate returning veterans in that influx. And taking a hard look at those structures, I'm not sure that attrition for adult learners, it's not obvious to me that's happening generally due to academic reasons. I think it's happening because of logistics, bad logistics that were designed in 1946. And I loved Sarah's post about that initial visit or revisit. Makes me think of our friends at Forsyth Technical College, where I sat there while the president said, if you walk past an adult learner and you are the vice president of enrollment management or you are on our maintenance staff, your job is to stop that adult learner and say, how can I help you? Because I can assure you who does do that. And that would be the for-profit higher education sector. And so I would talk to adult learners and find out what they need. And then I'd take a hard look at what it takes to get sitting in a class on day one. Are there academic challenges that need to be addressed from then on? Absolutely. But even getting an adult learner to that point probably requires a whole lot of the process auditing that many of the colleges on here from North Carolina have already done, but are only going to become more paramount, because my concern is we have a lot of adults that show up with fire and it's quickly doused by bureaucracy.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, so now let's open it up for Q&A from our audience. So if you'll drop your questions in the Q&A, it looks like we have one here. What's being done to assist immigrant adult students across the state, especially around foreign degree equivalencies, professional licensures for immigration impacted individual, and pathways from non-credit to credit programs? Shauna, do you want to kind of talk about that one potentially?
Yeah, I don't know that. I'm certainly not an expert in this particular area. So I don't know if that question was related specifically to North Carolina. So I'm not as familiar as far as what is being done in North Carolina to assist immigrant adult students in that particular. So I don't want to misspeak to that, because I think they were asking about.
Right. And the Hunnits too, they're actually going to answer that question live, so you can see that. But one thing I do want to speak to is thinking about some of our immigrant students here in our service area. When I said we retooled our marketing materials, we actually translated our materials into Spanish. So, or to the particular language within a particular group that we were approaching. And that was part of our recruiting. That was part of our shifting. We also hired a couple of people that were bilingual. That was really important. So if we were going to penetrate that community and get those individuals connected to our institution, then that was going to be really important. So that was something that just on a local level that we were able to do, thinking about those particular adults. Because if I look at the census data here, and that's mining that data, that's where our growth was going to be here in our service area. So that was really important. Okay. So here's a question. Realizing you can't tell an adult learner what they should major in, is there an effort to guide them to majors with strong workforce needs? I know Tennessee's Promise schools do a great job of matching skills to local employers. Mike, do you want to speak a little bit to that?
I do, if only because I'm fresh off a lot of campuses in North Carolina over the last several weeks. This goes back in some ways to kind of taking a look at things from an adult learner's perspective. I think for many years, we have viewed adult learners entering community colleges as what associate degree program can we get them in? And I don't think that's the case. I think we need to be thinking about what we in North Carolina call Con Ed and workforce training programs. I'm struck by, to your question, are we guiding adults that direction? I'll tell a story that I saw at Brunswick Community College, which is, first off, most adults show up knowing they need to finish what they started. I say this as someone who was an adult learner and didn't go to college after high school and went to college after being in the military. That entire time, it was nagging me that I needed to go back. But when an adult goes back, they're likely returning because they want to change their economic fortunes. And that message at Brunswick Community College, there's a billboard going in and it literally says 10 weeks to $45,000 at the local power company, where they had a lineman training program, which we also have up in Caldwell in North Carolina. I'm not sure that it's a matter of tracking the adults, but I absolutely think putting in front of them what those workforce outcomes look like is a huge guiding factor. And I think colleges should also feel very comfortable picking winners in terms of their academic programs that they know lead to a meaningful workforce outcome, and making a practical decision. Can we promote all the programs at once? Probably not. So let's focus on the programs where we know this adult in a short amount of time will attain a credential. It may be an associate's, it may be 10 weeks, and becoming comfortable with knowing, in my experience, anecdotal as it may be, that the first education credential an adult obtains typically leads to others, because that feeling of becoming more qualified, and oftentimes that feeling of setting an example for their children in terms of obtaining a credential, builds its own momentum.
Could I tack onto that just for a second, Dr. Leatherwood?
Absolutely.
I was going to say, I think one of the other things that, especially when it comes to kind of the career guidance or advising question around that, as far as what students or potential students choose and what they don't choose, is that sometimes we forget that it's hard to look at a list of things and make sense of that if you don't know what's possible for your life. You know, the kind of, you know, what you believe that you can be or what you want to be. And that sometimes we make school the destination, and it's not that people necessarily want to be in school, but they want, as Mike was saying, you know, you want to improve your economic situation for your family. So perhaps the goal is that I want to buy a home. I want to be able, you know, to do these sorts of things for my family. And it's less about, do I find, oh, this particular, you know, career or credential has meaning for me in terms of you know, work comparison, when I may or may not be familiar with being that thing, right? So I do think sometimes we have to kind of also draw out and help students not necessarily look at our lists or our categories, but understand what that could actually mean for what they're actually going for, which is their quality of life, which is, you know, what they're, you know, what they want to do for their families, or what they, you know, what they want to have. Maybe they want to have a steady schedule in health insurance. Maybe they want, it's not necessarily the same ways in which everyone looks at, you know, what's a desirable career. So I just say that I think that's always important too, from an advising or a career guidance situation, that we don't assume that people have, you know, look for the same things or put the same meaning into certain positions or places, or even the dollar amount. But when we ask people about what do you really want for your life, being able to translate that into doing these types of jobs or getting these types of careers could help you actually reach that end goal, which is really what you're looking for.
And if I can piggyback too real quick, I mean, let's not forget, I mean, we've talked about advisors, but I think just as critical are your teachers in the classroom, your instructors at the community college. Sometimes once you've met that one individual, I mean, they become and you just establish a relationship, they become quite a mentor. And next thing you know, they're going to follow in their footsteps and become, a nurse practitioner or, various things. So I think it's also important to keep in mind that once you get them in the door, the people you have on staff in your community college itself, can make a huge difference and just as much of an impact as maybe perhaps their end goal as well. So I just want to lift up those folks too, because they're so critical to this work.
And what I would say to everyone that works at a college, be that person, right? And I think Mike talked about that. Be that adult person for any question that they might want to ask. And I think that's really important. And so here's another question for the institutional leaders on the call. I'm curious if reforming practices to better serve students with past due balances was part of your work, and how do your institutions help navigate the transcript and or registration holds that result from an overdue balance? So I'll speak to a little bit of that. We used our federal HERF dollars, right, to actually do some of that. But in addition to using our federal HERF dollars for students, we also raised money because we didn't want $50 that they owed us from 10 years ago to stop them from enrollment. So we said, okay, we're going to give you a $50 scholarship to pay that. Let's get you enrolled. So we had those federal dollars, but it did require locally for me to try to raise some money as the president to ensure that we have some discretionary funds that we could help a student. Because can you imagine a $50 bill or a $54 leftover charge from 10 years ago stopping somebody from finishing their education? We weren't going to let that happen. So I think the onus is on you locally, right? If you don't have any of those discretionary funds, I think that's really important to have those on hand. Okay, let's see. Here's a couple of other questions. Here's one. When it comes to the faith-based community, what are some suggested first steps in getting the recruiting ball rolling in that sector? So I'll speak to that. When we were mining the data and we were looking at different communities, there was a community, we had an African-American church, and we really wanted to try to touch that population. We had someone that actually attended the church, and they allowed us to come in between the worship service on Sunday and the meal, and they gave us 10 minutes to address the congregation about Blue Ridge Community College and the opportunities for people that were members of their church. And so that's where we started. And think about your employees, think about the people that you know in the community. They're all connected to some kind of club, church. They affiliate with something. And I think that not even just faith-based, but there's so many of those. If you could penetrate all of those, just think how far you can actually reach into your communities. And it's labor-intensive work, but that's how you reach people in these rural areas.
I agree. I was going to second that, Laura. I do think that happens a lot more in your rural communities and your rural counties than perhaps in the urban areas, but they are not to be overlooked. They can be great partners. And then I think they find themselves, learning just as much as they're educating others too. So, and I would say in North Carolina, that is sort of a sector that we are working on, and even as we kind of target in and zero in on our attainment goal. The My Future NC organization that we partner with is dialed into that space too right now, trying to figure out what are some really solid avenues and communication efforts we can partner with those communities on.
Mike, I wanted to pose a question to you because I, as somebody that attends these webinars, I want takeaways like best practices. So I'm going to ask you, of all the Reconnect colleges, what are some of the best practices that you're seeing at our institutions that may be great takeaways for our audience?
Yes, here's a lightning round. Pitt Community College and Dr. Lawrence Rouse and his team realized early on that instead of trying to rebuild the higher ed bureaucracy for adults, just have an adult one-stop and have everybody work there. And that has been incredible to see now diffuse at several locations across the state. Dr. Leatherwood, not just because you're the moderator, but what Blue Ridge has done that is best in class is message, we got you on cost. Because the reality is many adult students are going to be coming with full Pell, but they don't know it. And unless you bring that bridge to them that says, hey, we've got you on tuition, I think it's really hard to get some adults across that Rubicon. Third, I would highlight Central Carolina Community College, who tied to this faith-based work. Dr. Chapman and her team, when you go to their Adult Learner Summit meetings, there are about 4 people in there from the college and about 10 ministers. And that's when I knew this is going to work, because like community colleges, ministers find themselves in the emergency rooms of humanity. And there's a lot in common between a community college student center and a church in terms of the types of problems that are being addressed. And then finally, I would love to highlight what we do for students who are out of SAP. And for those that aren't distinctly familiar with satisfactory academic progress, typically defined as going below a 2.0, this is a real problem for adult learners. Many adult learners find themselves wanting to re-enroll but can't receive Pell because they're not in compliance with SAP. In my experience, there are very few people out of SAP with a 0.8 and a whole lot of people out of SAP with a 1.9. And what Fayetteville Technical Community College did, both with federal funds and with some funding from the John M. Belk Endowment, was go to those SAP students and say, hey, we'll spot you the class you need that gets you above 2.0 and back into Pell. So those are some diverse takeaways, Dr. Leatherwood. I hoped it hit the right note. But one thing I would just say is all of these decisions require leaders to be courageous, because doing the same thing will never lead us to connect with adult learners. But on the other end of things, and Senator Ballard mentioned this, the FTE enrollment and benefit is real. And in our 2 cohorts, we're looking at $2.1 million of new funding generated by reconnectors. And the piece I'm probably most excited about is when you have nearly 1,800 adults back in college via Reconnect, well, that's essentially creating a new community college worth of enrollment, given the size of some of our community colleges.
Mike, that was great. And one best practice I think that I kind of want to add to the mix that we tested out, I mentioned earlier that we hired a success coach for every one of our returning adults. And the data show we're seeing a 90 to 95, even 97% success rate for the semester for those adults that have a coach. And that's essentially the athletic model, right? They have somebody that touches base with them every week, sometimes multiple times a week, saying, what's going on at home? What's going on in your classroom? What can I help you with? And we are seeing some really great numbers. And if we can translate successful semesters to a next semester to completion, this could be a game changer. So we're really watching those numbers. I think that investment, you're talking about return on investment, was worth its weight in gold to us. So something to really think about there as your success coaches.
May I add something? In terms of the state level and kind of even a best practice, having gone through this now even for a couple of years ourselves, I mean, really be proactive in engaging perhaps education partners. I mean, don't be afraid to go into, you know, public-private partnerships in order to get some of this work done and leverage state dollars against private dollars, et cetera. I mean, even at a local level. And then I would also encourage state leaders not to stifle innovation at the local level. I mean, let those leaders at those community colleges really, you know, think outside the box and let them move and be nimble in order to meet those needs of the community as well. And then also just remain on the front end of economic development. And then you can fold in your community colleges, your training programs, your certificates, whatever you need to do on the front end, as opposed to thinking about it as an afterthought. So as a state leader, that's one thing I've really kind of honed in on a bit too, is how to get lift up more of our training programs. We got a lot of new business coming into North Carolina. How can we make sure they're a part of that incentive package, perhaps out of the gate, as opposed to thinking about it after the fact? So those are just kind of 3 points I'd like to make.
So we've got a question in the chat, and I'll send it to our panel. Do adult learners benefit from, are they interested in peer-to-peer support programs? I recognize that re-enrolling adults is one challenge, but so is keeping them enrolled. Shauna, have you had some experience with this peer-to-peer support programs?
I've had some experience, and I think the answer is it depends. So, I think, Mike, I see you shaking your head, right? And you said, go back and ask. I think it depends because, to this idea that, there are some adult learners where if we clear the bureaucracy, if we have programs that are designed for them, they want to come in and come through, and they'll come on and they'll come through, and they can get what they need and move on. And then there are others who may need more additional support. And it certainly helps when someone has your lived experience, or you can identify with someone in a way in which they understand what you're going through. So I think that, to me, from what I've seen, the answer to that is it absolutely depends. It depends on your population of students and depends on what they need. I think the answer to that also is it's very important for us to have people on our campuses who are kind of fluent in working with lots of different students who have different backgrounds and different needs. It doesn't always have to be someone who is an adult to an adult. It doesn't always have to be someone who is African-American to African-American. It can be, someone who understands and empathizes and can relate in an authentic way to someone and what they're going through, and it can provide real real answers or just support to what they're going through in a way that makes people feel seen and heard and supported.
Okay, here's another question for the panel. A critical part of the NC Reconnect program is utilizing data. We spoke a little bit about that, and technology to connect with students. How are institutions increasing their capacity to develop a real-time feedback loop, including data and new technology to make informed decisions and interventions? Mike, can you speak a little bit to that? And I can help a little bit too locally.
What I would just say is the starting point is the data you already have, which in North Carolina, and I know there are folks from around the nation, it's very high quality data. We know who these students are. You're able to do, at this point, a pretty standard pool out of colleague that everybody generally knows how to write across the 58, those that are on colleague. As far as using that data in real time, we have a community college where the president, during Reconnect, their hot season with Inside Track, the president was meeting with the adult learner team every single Monday to hold a war room. And literally, these are knowable facts, y'all. There's like 80 adults. Can you talk through 80 adults? Absolutely, you can. And that president did that. And they sat there and said, wait, why is the number down last week? Did they not go to class? Because let's all be honest, if an adult learner doesn't go to class 3 times, we're probably not going to see them again. I think the best answer I can give without being in the weeds, because I'm not IR and IE, would be it matters what presidents devote their time to. And when presidents say we're doing a war room every Monday, staff show up prepared. And that means there's all these other ripples of conversations that zero in on adults. That president is Dr. Leatherwood. And I apologize for embarrassing you, but it is a very tangible thing that if every president did tomorrow, if you talk to Tim Rennick at Georgia State, they'll tell you, yes, the data mattered, but the meetings mattered just as much.
Yes, that was me. But what was really, what it did though, we talked about processes, and I'll just kind of finish up here. But when I was looking at that data, for example, if I saw FAFSA applications, one week I would look at the number of FAFSA applications that came through, and it said 0 during the height of when we should be out the roof with FAFSA applications. And I said, what's going on here? Well, come to find out, the person that pulls down the applications was on vacation. And I learned that nobody else could do that but one person. So I didn't have redundancy in my process. Therefore, I had students that were waiting on to see would they qualified for Pell. So I found a hole in the process by me looking at the data on Monday going, what is wrong with that number? It should be higher. And I think you can look at, there's so many different data points, but what it does, it requires leaders looking at that. Please know our General Assembly is going to be looking at that. They're going to be looking at the numbers. They invested in us to do this work. That's how important the data is. And I don't know, Deanna, you have some comments. I know you do.
Well, I do. I mean, it's just funny. I don't want to make folks to really overthink the data part, because it's pretty elementary. It's laborious. I mean, Laura, you know that. I mean, there were things you were doing by hand, and gathering data and collecting information in order to analyze it to make these informed decisions. So I would just say, start small, like bite size, like Mike even talked about too, even in terms of data, start with what you have. But then, as you move along, be thinking about those questions that you want to get answered. And so that's how you start to figure out kind of what data you want to collect and what story it's telling. Separately, I would say in terms of new technology that folks have used, and this is not something I've seen in North Carolina quite yet, we've talked about it, but chatbot, folks have been using that, I think, in Hillsborough Community College down in Florida. So there's some interesting other, I guess, kind of interventions that are out there, so to speak, that are actually kind of stepping in as some of these inside track folks that we've used, perhaps, that have been successful, have proven to be successful too. But again, that's just relative to your community, to kind of your neighborhood and your college. So I just kind of mentioned that there are some things in that space in terms of technology to think about.
I would also add CRMs matter. And I never thought in the adult learner policy space we'd spend so much time talking about CRMs, but they matter. And when you see a college really moving the needle, it's often because they figured out a way how to get their hands around many disparate pieces of data to tell one story. And I just wanted to throw that in there. You can tell a difference when you show up to a college to talk data and they've got a CRM.
Okay, we're getting kind of close to our time. I want to give the panel one more opportunity. Any last parting comments that you guys would like to make before we close? Shauna, you go first.
Yeah, I would just say really quickly that I think what this all comes down to is being very clear about what our intentions are and our approach. So, I always kind of come back to that whatever you do, especially with adults, folks who are a little more seasoned in life, it has to be authentic or people will be able to sense that out quite quickly.
Thank you, Shauna. Mike, you want to go next?
I would just say that we have the proper amount, I think, of context that almost every campus is thinking hard about this and figuring out how we can all row in the same direction, even in a decentralized state like North Carolina. There are colleges that are figuring this out every day, and we can make some quantum jumps if we do that, learning lessons and diffusing what we learn across the state rather than having to learn them over and over.
Senator Ballard?
I would just say I'm encouraged. I'm excited, and I think you should be too. I think we talk about challenges a lot. We always talk about what we need, what the hurdles are. But I am super proud of the work that's going on with NC Reconnect and the stories and the lives that are being impacted. So I think we talk about the end user. Let's just talk about how also we're really lifting up those families and those individuals to really pursue, the career of their dreams. And so to be able to be a part of that and a part of that story in whatever way you can be is powerful. So just don't underestimate that, but just continue to offer up encouragement and hope to all your community campuses and just across all sectors in education too.
Thank you, Senator Ballard, Mike, Shauna, for joining us today, this engaging, informative discussion. Before we close, my colleague at the Hunt Institute is going to be sharing links to their upcoming webinar, so you might want to check those out. Also, I just want to say thank you for joining us today. I hope that you were able to take just one small nugget of information back to your campuses, back to your states that might be helpful. We've been doing this work working with adults forever, but now it's even more important that we kind of retool and rethink and reignite the work at our community colleges. So thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you guys on the next webinar. Have a good afternoon.